Welcome to the third episode of the In and For podcast. I'm Shelley Komaszewski.
I'm Brock Anderson, and here at the N4 podcast, we talk about how and why we are in and for Christ and how to be in and for culture for its ultimate good. And we believe that ultimate good is pointing culture to the essential truths of Christianity, why the Christian worldview makes the best sense out of the way the world is, and why we need rescue from it.
Very nice. Today, what's our subject?
Today, we're talking about probably the most important thing you'll hear today.
That's a big claim.
Because everything we're talking about relates to somebody you're going to see today. So we're talking about generations. So everyone you encounter today is going to fall into one of the generations that we're talking about. And specifically, we're talking about how to relate to the kinds of questions different generations are asking when it comes to spiritual things and what matters most.
This is going to be fun. All right, we were ready. We have 5 generations to get through.
We do.
We'll keep it short and pithy. Boomers are up first. We're born 1946 to 1964. And if that doesn't mean a whole lot to you, just year-wise, that's okay. Me neither. So let's talk. They set culture in the 60s and 70s. Some of their favorite shows were the Andy Griffith Show.
Andy Griffith Show.
Leave It to Beaver.
Yeah, Leave It to Beaver. It's a good show.
Gilligan's Island was better. My dad's very favorite. Boomers make up currently 21% of the population today. We're the first generation to grow up with a TV, home appliances, and birth control. All of those had major ramifications for culture and how people interacted with each other and the world around them. For boomers, their spiritual question of the day: what is true?
What is true?
They grew up in a time when objective truth was something to be sought after. And when it was found, it was worth giving their lives to.
Yeah. Here's what happened, and here's what's true. Boomers were raised by the Great Generation, and a generation that saw things as black and white and true and false and right and wrong. And while they were raised by this generation, they had the birth of what we call individualism, the birth of choice. As they are being raised by this right and wrong and true and false, they began to rebel against that idea. And we see that in culture and the kinds of things that they did. Men growing their hair longer in rebellion against what their parents said. Joining the volunteer army began in rebellion against conscription. And we had the things like rebellion against even sexual culture, because we have the beginning of birth control. As they rebelled in that way as well. And so this is why that search for truth happened, is they didn't buy into things are just black and white and right and wrong, that there's an area to be explored there. And they tried to explore it through individualism, which led to that question that they're asking spiritually, which is, well, if what my parents told me isn't true, if it's not just black and white and right and wrong, then what is true?
It's a good question. So for the boomers in your life, how do we start spiritual questions with them? So let's talk about a little bit when we focus on boomers and their spiritual question is, what is true? Here's some questions to ponder to start the conversation. Maybe what was the last time you wondered whether or not we could know the truth about God?
Yeah, it's a great question, because when you're talking to somebody who has been searching for truth and has found it and has sought to find it in what they've discovered to be not so good places during the baby boomer generation, is the birth of the self-help culture of trying to find answers from within. And a lot of boomers have discovered that those all lead to dead ends. And so they're still looking for that answer to what is true. And so we have that amazing opportunity to ask them that question of, like, have you ever wondered when was the last time you've thought about something that you know is true about God, or can we know truth about God? And allowing them to explore that in front of you in the midst of a conversation.
Yeah. So those are spiritual questions for boomers. So boomers asked what is true and responded. We can respond with evidence that Jesus himself is ultimate truth and sure worth banking your life on. That's the boomers. Now we get to Generation X, my generation. And yes, let's talk about that. They set culture in the 80s and 90s. Gen X was born between 1965 and 1979. Some of our favorite shows were Happy Days, Miami Vice. Remember the style of Miami Vice?
I do, yes. Speedboats and fast cars.
And the jackets. Moving on. The $6 Million Man and Seinfeld, of course, which was a show about
Nothing.
but really, at its core, what was interesting is it was really about a set of friends.
Yeah.
And we see that play out in just a second with their spiritual question.
Yeah.
Gen Xers today make about 18% of the population. Gen X has been called the TV generation or MTV generation. Boomers were introduced to the TV, but Gen X was the first one to just take it for granted. What that meant is it brought united pop culture because everything was watching the same 3 channels and everybody was talking about the same thing. Very different today. Also, a huge thing that happened with Gen X is a culture gap came when the World Wide Web, the internet, was introduced. So my sister and I are 3 years apart, 3 years and 3 months. I did not have the internet in college. She did. Those 3 years, a radical different change in how we viewed information and how we viewed the world around us. Big change.
Yeah, and I think that amount of information led to several different questions that Gen X was asking that the boomers weren't asking. But most importantly, what Gen X saw was a generation that knew things were true in word and the way that they talked. They talked about things being right or wrong or true or false. But like we just talked about, this is a generation that rebelled in experience against these things, but they still knew truth and right and wrong. And yes, the boomers. And so they would explain this as they're raising their kids, which became to be Gen X. But here's the problem. Gen X heard this teaching on right and wrong, but they saw experientially a life that looked different. And so it brought a different kind of question from Gen X. And their question is, what is authentic?
What is authentic?
Yes.
Love it.
Where's an authenticity?
Dad, they were all about truth, but they didn't live it out. They spoke it and didn't live it. And my generation says, I don't trust it. I'd rather have something authentic and real. So that sent us on the quest.
And that makes sense because that Gen X is sometimes called, the reason it's explained that they're called Gen X sometimes is that X is like a variable in a math equation where you don't know what the number is, so you just put X there. And Gen X is often described as, I know this is offensive to you, is often described as a generation that knows who it is, not because they know who they are, but they know who they are not. They are not their parents, the boomers, and they don't know anything about this generation that came after them, the millennials, that seem like aliens, but they belong half and half to both of them. They were in part of the boomer generation. They were growing up at the end of the rotary phone and videotapes and tapes in general. And then as they got older, technology shifted, and they were part of the millennial generation where there was the birth of the internet and of YouTube and of Google and all these different things that came out at that time. So they literally were a generation without a firm footing.
And things were changing so quickly. I remember in high school, my boyfriend's mother got the very first car phone and he called me from it. And I thought, what is the world coming to? You can talk on the phone in the car. Little did we know what was coming. So what the questions of what does it mean to be authentic?
Yeah.
I think is interesting though, because if you look back over some of the accomplishments of my generation, the whole emotional EQ instead of IQ intelligence, the emotional intelligence, that all came from this generation, like the self-help came from the boomers. Yeah. And so now we're a little more in sync. And what's important with our feelings, but what's important is to watch the generations and watch the shift in it that you're going to point out. I'm sorry, I got us off track. So
no, that's okay. Well, back on track just means like, why are they asking this question of what is authentic? And we talked a little bit about that of its feet planted in two different generations, the one before and the one after them. But when they're asking this question is what is authentic and what is real, it informs us about how to approach this generation. And this is really important because generations tend to look at other generations, and especially those that are older, looking at ones that are younger, and just say, oh, it's hopeless. You can't reach these people for Christ, because they think so differently than I do. They don't even care about truth anymore. And that will start even with Gen X a little bit. And it's just like, well, when we see how this generation approaches life and the kind of questions they're asking, it's not just an anathema to an approach to Christianity or to Christ. It's an avenue for how to approach them for Christ. And so if I know a generation is concerned about authenticity or what is real, then it lets me know that the kinds of questions to ask, like, what does it look like when you're the most authentic version of yourself? And where do you tend to turn when you let yourself down? If you're looking within for the answers and authenticity or being the most authentic version of yourself matters the most, Well, then what happens when you let yourself down? Because that happens. We all fail to live up to our own moral standard, our own standard of how we think we ought to be. And so pointing that out in the midst of a conversation as you move to more serious topics creates space for them to think and work through that and open the door to some really amazing discussions about how Christ is the answer to authenticity.
That's a good one. Another one that I've used is, do you think God has authentic concern for you?
Yeah.
This isn't a God who set things in motion and sits back with his arms folded like a lot of our parents did. Instead, it's a God who entered humankind and became man and lived the life that we couldn't live, died the death we should have died, and brings us into fellowship with the Father. Another just great way to start a spiritual conversation. You don't have to have the answers for all of this, but being bold enough to engage the heart. So truth doesn't change, but the objections to it, the stumbling blocks, change per generation.
Yep.
And that's what we're trying to talk about today.
That's
So
right.
Gen X asked what is real, what is authentic, and you can respond with the message of how Jesus is real, meets us in our pain, paid the price for our sin to bring us into authentic relationship with the Father. That's Gen X. All right, millennials. Here we go. Millennials were born 1980 to 1994. They set culture in the 2000s. And let's be fair, they had some fantastic favorite TV shows.
They did, yes.
Office, Grey's Anatomy, Gilmore Girls.
Okay.
Sorry, that was really screechy and high.
Yeah.
Big Bang Theory, and how about Parks and Rec?
Yeah.
Those were some of the favorite ones that defined a generation. Today, millennials make up about 20% of the populations. And millennials saw individualism move from important to paramount.
Yes, yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah, individualism moved from important to paramount. We've seen the research that shows the use of words like I and me, even in printed or online literature, just increased dramatically over the time of the generation of millennials. There was more of a concern for I and me. And this makes sense because they were raised by a generation that cared deeply about authenticity and the true version of myself. And so the me mattered, the I mattered more than anything. And so what did Gen X do? They raised a generation where they said, hey, the focus is all on you. I mean, this is the generation where all of a sudden we start talking about participation trophies and you're important just because you're important. And
Everybody gets a ribbon.
yeah, and everybody's good just because they are and just because they exist. And there became some problems with that because there was never an exception to what determines who is good. And there was no grounding for making that claim of, hey, you're good. And here's why. It's just, you're good. And I think you want to talk a little bit about how they were the first raised in a different kind of age, of information age.
Technology. Seriously, for the boomers, think about it for a second. This is crazy. The internet was commercialized in 1995. In their formative years, they were maybe 8 to 10. Then 13, when the home internet became common, Facebook, social media launched.
Yep.
The majority of Americans owned smartphones in 2012. So from the very first car phone, remember for the boomers, they got the microwave and the pill. And watch how quickly technology sped up.
That's
So
right.
millennials, the way they engaged with people changed in front of them. Technology was at an all-time fast pace.
It was.
Little did we know it would continue to keep up, but I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yeah, but one of the most important stats about millennials is that they're the least religious generation on the planet, or at least were at the time. They're likely to be eclipsed by Gen Z over time. But that's really important. And I think this is an important kind of stopping point to look at that funnel that we see in regard to truth, that we have the great generation where everything was just true or false or right or wrong. And then we have the boomers where there was this birth of kind of individualism and choice and trying to search for what I think is right and not believing what my parents are telling me necessarily. And then that leads into Gen X where it becomes this search for authenticity. And that moves into the millennials where it's more me focused and I focused than ever before. And so we're moving further and further away from objective truth and further closer to subjective truth. And that's relativism. That's what relativism is. It's the all truth is really dependent upon the subject, which is why it's called subjective truth. And seeing that funnel is really important when you're looking at generations and talking to generations, to know that if I'm talking talking to somebody at the Great Generation or even Gen X, Boomers, sorry, I can talk about truth and right and wrong, but the younger somebody gets, the more I'm going to have a starting point from an individual and experiential standpoint. And that's really where millennials are focused on and why they're asking the question they're asking, because their question is, what is good?
What is good?
They were raised at a time when they're told, I am good or you are good and everything is good all the time. But here's what happened when something like a Great Recession happens or a pandemic happens or we have social justice upheavals happen. All of a sudden I was told that everything's supposed to be good, but it's not. And so now I'm left asking, what is good and how is good determined? And that gives us, instead of an opportunity to criticize and condemn, it gives us an opportunity to find an avenue. Because if they're asking that question, what is good? We have an amazing answer.
We do. So for millennials, the spiritual question of the day was, what is good? This generation, they're doers. They want to contribute and they want to change the world. They want to do something and get involved. Experience is very important to this generation. They even watch TV differently. Now they vote for their idols. So if experience is the ultimate for this generation, millennials want what is good about the Christian faith. They want to know what's good about it. They are the first generation not simply to seek fire insurance or life after death, but they want to know what is good about the Christian faith for today. What's good about the Christian faith for my life and the life of the world around me. Over half of millennials claim to be Christian, but it's a Christian faith of their own making, a vending machine faith, so to speak. I'll take a little of that, because at the center, like you said, is me, and I'm trying to make it work. I believe in God, yes, and I need it to work for me. I have to be able to experience it in my way.
Yeah, which means that if experience, not just observing, but participating. So my performance matters. And so this is where we have borrowing from a lot of different religions, which is syncretism,
Yes.
to come to have my own version of Christianity. And a big part of that is working to obtain your salvation, because you're playing more of a part than ever. And so we see the rise in the amount of people that are answering that question of, hey, what do you think is required to get to heaven? And you get that answer of, well, just being a good person. And again, that opens the door to a great question of, how would you describe the ultimate quote unquote good person? And do you fit that description? Because that's a good opportunity to allow someone from this generation to describe, oh, they should be like this and this and this and this and do this. And they're going to describe themselves out of a job. And when they do, you have the great opportunity to then show them that, hey, our performance can never be the thing that gets us right before God, because all of us falter and flail and ultimately fail at being the kind of person we want to be or ought to be. We have what G.K. Chesterton called the problem of the ought, that we all have a recognition of how we ought to be, and we all fail to live up to that recognition. So that's a great point to bring out to somebody who thinks that they can work their way to salvation. And millennials are definitely in that camp of, it's about me and my performance and my effort, and I should just be accepted because of how and who I am. I'm always doing what's required to be good. And another question there is, suppose there's a heaven where ultimate satisfaction awaits. What do you think is required to get there? And allowing them to work through that.
That's so good. Millennials asked what is good, and you can respond with messages of ways to experience the goodness of the gospel.
Yep, that's right.
Now we are on to Gen Z.
Gen Z.
My kiddo's age. Yeah, I skipped a generation, I guess. Gen Z were born from 1995 to 2012. There are 70 million Gen Zers, the largest U.S. generation yet, 24% of the population. Gen Z's favorite shows? There aren't any. They are all streaming services. So we've talked about the speed of technology, and now they don't have favorite shows. They stream their favorite podcast, their favorite movie, their favorite music, everything on demand, instant gratification. The oldest of the Gen Z was 12 when the iPhone arrived. So it's an entire generation that was raised that everything there was to know fit in their pocket. Remember the old encyclopedias? Like instant gratification generation.
Yeah, and Gen Z just had a unique perspective on entertainment, like you just said, and I was just like, hey, there aren't any television shows listed here, and that's why. Because I remember when we did this version of this content at an apologetics conference, and we had somebody say we were talking about television and the amount of time that people watch television, and he just excitedly rose his hand and said, "Well, I don't watch TV at all." And we're like, "Well, what do you do?" And he ended up walking us through basically 7 hours a day of streaming on his phone. It was like, "Oh, okay. Well, you're consuming content in the same way that someone would if they were watching hours of television." It was just kind of like an open eye moment for that individual. But yeah, Gen Z, they don't know what it's like to have to wait a week for the next episode of something to show up. It's all right there on demand.
In 2021, Gen Z was the only generation that believed there was more than two genders. The technology and the global worldview has now changed a whole lot more than just how they get their streaming services. So Gen Z is the first post-Christian, post-truth, postmodern.
Postmodern, yeah, postmodern, metamodern is what it's called now. Yeah, yeah.
I was paused like I didn't get that right. So everything's changing how they view social justice, how they view sexuality. Everything has changed in light of being inclusive.
Yeah, and again, that makes sense because they're raised by millennials, often called the me generation, where the focus was more on self than ever before. And again, they were told they were good just because they're good. Well, if you're good and there's no grounding for being good, you're just good because you are the way you are. Well, it opens the door of opportunity for you to say, well, I can be anyone and I can be anything. And so then those individuals are now raising their children, which is Gen Z, who now become the generation that says, well, hey, anyone can be anything. Anyone can be anything they want to be. And so there is no longer a question that's grounded in truth or even in authenticity or goodness. Now you have this question about, hey, what is good to me? What's right? What seems right to me? It's the most experiential question that's asked, because the question for Gen Z is, what is beautiful and what is just? Because that's the way that they're viewing the world and reality. And again, I just in church on Sunday, I just ran into somebody in a class where we were talking about generations, and they had that moment where they threw their hands up and, oh, you can't talk to Gen Z about anything because they truth is all relative, and it's true for me and it's true for you. And I had the chance to stop him and just say, hey, they look at things differently because how they were raised, and the speed of technology and the amount of voices that they're hearing from everywhere, from all these different digital outlets. And when they've come to this conclusion of beauty and justice, while we don't start with truth like we would with an older generation, you start instead with what's beautiful about the gospel, what's beautiful about Christianity, what's beautiful about the way God is. And as we start working from there, you then work your way to truth. Whereas with an older generation, you may start with, here's what's true.
Right.
Now, let me show you why it's beautiful and attractive. Here, you're starting with, why is it beautiful and attractive? Now, let me surprise you and tell you that this is actually true.
Oh, that is so incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I think it's
another
cool.
opportunity that Gen Z gives us that the other generations didn't have is the high mental health risks of this generation is actually a beautiful opportunity. Let me read you just a couple stats. 90% of Gen Z has said that they have experienced anxiety, 79% loneliness, 78% depression. And the global pandemic only accelerated these trends. We have older generations that are so focused on truth, they would never admit to being broken or lonely or hurting. That Gen Z is so aware of these things and willing to talk about it gives us a beautiful entry point into the gospel.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They're more willing to admit the brokenness that they see, which is why you see statistics and information out there about the younger generations being more ready and willing to talk about spiritual things than any other generation before them, because they're in desperate search for this beautiful answer to the ugliness that they see everywhere, and including within them, that they're more willing to admit than ever before. So what a great opportunity that gives us to ask them just wonderful questions, and about, like, when you see something beautiful, Like the last time you saw something that just captured your attention and captivated you and saw it was beautiful, what if that beauty was pointing to something greater? Um, Not just something, but someone. And I'd love to walk you through, number one, that's a true statement. It is pointing to someone greater. And let me tell you why. And then just talking about the beauty of what Jesus has accomplished, who Jesus is, what he's accomplished, what's required to get to heaven, and give this grace-filled message of this is who God is, starting with beauty.
I love that. Another way, if their spiritual questions are what is beautiful, what is just, question, do you think justice and love can coexist? Have you ever experienced both at the same time? What an amazing question to get people to open up.
Yeah, it gets them to open up because, number one, they have experienced justice and beauty at the same time. Anytime somebody has stopped them from doing something that would cause self-harm or danger, and they've realized it later that friend was actually doing something very beautiful and wonderful for them, they've experienced the justice of somebody withholding them from doing something they wanted to do, and which is the right thing to do. And then they experience the beauty of a friend coming in and helping them. And when you give them examples like this, and maybe you might need to provide like a starting scenario like that, you're able to show them how the ultimate example of beauty and justice was Christ, as when he gave his life on the cross. This is the beauty of what he accomplished on our behalf. And it's the justice of God pouring out his wrath upon his son so that we may have forgiveness of sins through him. And that allows us to both give examples of how this exists in the world, how Jesus epitomized this. He's the fulfillment of beauty and justice, and that the thing that they're looking for, the justice they look for and the beauty that they desire, is ultimately fulfilled and found in Jesus, which is also ultimately fulfilled and found in historical fact. It's not just a dream or a fantasy or something that we wish were true as Christians. This is something we can bring in classical apologetics. Yeah, we're an apologetics ministry. We should know how to say this word. Bringing in classical apologetics to show there's good reasons to believe this is true, but to be able to show that the ultimate fulfillment of beauty and justice is in Jesus is what a great opportunity. And one other thing I wanted to say about Gen Z is just this is the most apathetic generation on the planet. This is brought out in Jonathan Haidt's book on the anxious generation, which has some of the stats that Shelley was talking about. But this is the generation that is more than happy for you to experience things for yourself, and you've experienced Christ, and you have your own experience with God, and they'll listen to you. But once you start telling them that this is something that is true for them to hold on to, that's when you'll get disengagement, because it's like, oh, I'm happy for you that you found that. I'm on my own quest for beauty and justice. The thing here is just to think through the fact that they may be apathetic about that, but they're not apathetic about everything. There's things that they find joy and fulfillment in, and we have, again, the opportunity to show them that those things, whatever that is found in, if it's not found in Jesus, it's something that's temporary and fading and crumbling, whether that's a person or a family or a job or finances, wherever it is that they're seeking joy and fulfillment. When we show that that's limited and that's falling apart and temporary, we have a chance to point them to a source of joy and fulfillment that is everlasting.
That's so good.
It is. It's awesome.
So good.
It's awesome how God creates an opportunity for every generation to reach them for Christ.
As if it was there.
It's almost as if
a new generation is growing up. Generation Alpha, or Gen A, or recently I heard Gen AI. The birth years is 2012 through 2025 currently.
Yep.
They will set culture next. Gen Alpha is growing up in a world shaped strongly by digital experiences. Where Gen Z grew up with everything to know in their pocket, Gen Alpha walks into a room and says, Siri, turn on the lights, or Alexa, turn on the TV, or pull up this. They talk to the air and things respond.
Yep.
That is insane. So digital experiences are quickly moving. The whole AI experience will transform how we process things. They have deep social activism and a deep desire for belonging and truth. They value authenticity, creativity, and relational connections.
Yeah, and we know the least about this generation because they're still being born. And so we don't have as much to comment on this generation. Even the latest books that are out there on generations don't really touch on Gen Alpha as much as they could, and even some start to talk about Beta, but not much on Alpha. But we know enough to know that they are asking the question of what is real and what does it mean to be human, because they are more insulated from other people and the real world than any other generation before them. They are so interconnected with technology and artificial intelligence and augmented intelligence and or augmented reality and all these things that take you away from what's real, that their conversations are asynchronistic, which are asynchronistic, we'll say, where they no longer talk face to face and in real time. But the conversations they have are listening to somebody's feed of somebody that recorded and posted something online, and then that person does the same thing for them, but they do less and less actual synchronous conversations where they get to know people. That makes them less connected with reality than any other generation before them.
So lots of questions, and we don't know the answers, but will they flip the script? Will this be the generation that says, no more, we need real, we need truth? To be determined.
To be determined, yeah.
We are excited. So we will be watching faithfully to some of that. But the Gen Alpha in your life, I know they're young, but we can still start some spiritual conversations. So moms and dads, grandpas and grandmas, friends, aunts and uncles, with that sweet Gen Alpha in your life, what are some ways we can start spiritual conversations?
Yeah, I mean, do you think we're here for a reason? Like if you're...
Oh, that's so good.
If you're... and again, this is not a question that is something you like wouldn't necessarily ask an older generation. There's plenty of generations that focus on purpose and meaning, but this is a generation that's so absent from reality that they're less inclined to think about, I'm here for a reason, I'm here for a purpose. And so when you're asking them questions around what does it mean to be human, and you're saying, do you think that we're here for a reason? How are we different from all the experiences out there that are digitally driven? How are we different from AI? How are we different from even the animal world? Like what makes us different and unique, which again opens the doors to being created in the image of God, being created for a purpose to glorify him, of being somebody that has intrinsic value because we're made in that image, not value because of the image that I portray online and various platforms.
That can preach. Recently, I was speaking to a sweet junior higher girl at church, and I asked, have you ever felt that there's something more to life than what we see? And it was a great way to begin getting her to start thinking outside the box a little bit. And what do you think that might be? What could that something more be? And then what if that longing is actually God inviting us to know him? And we had the sweetest conversation. So just some examples of how to start spiritual questions with the Gen Alpha in your life. So those are their 5 generations.
The 5 generations.
A whole lot of information in a very short time. So let's just do a quick recap. The boomers asked,
what is true?
What is true? Gen X asked, what is authentic? The millennials asked, what is good? Gen Z asked, what is beautiful? What is just? And Gen Alpha is asking, what is real? What does it mean to be human? All of those are wonderful opportunities for us to engage and point directly to the gospel.
Yeah, and I want those listening and watching to understand that these aren't like direct quote questions to walk up to somebody from a certain generation and just ask them.
Are you a boomer?
Yeah.
Question for you.
Yeah.
That's the point of this podcast.
That is not. It is not the point for you to go up to somebody looking at an apple in a grocery store and just saying, hey, when's the last time you thought something is true about God? Or can you know truth about God? But what they are their starting points for you to think through how to engage with this question. Because that may not be, you may hear that question and may think of somebody that's a boomer in your life. And you may think, I would never ask them that question. But it's a category of a question that you can come up with, knowing that what they are concerned about is what is true. And so what's a version of that question that would make the most sense for the person you do know in your life, that you know the kinds of conversations that you have on a daily basis or a weekly basis with your neighbor and your coworker and your peers? What's a version of that question that you can ask and to get them thinking about truths that we can know about God, knowing that an entire generation was raised by this black and white, right and wrong, true and false generation, and are searching for what's top of mind is what is true. And when you tap into that, it opens the door for you to have a wonderful conversation that gets you to deeper and more spiritual topics faster, so that you can start moving people in your life one step closer to Jesus. That's why you're listening to the podcast. That's why we have this podcast, to take elements from cultural apologetics and evangelism and make them practical for you to apply. And in this podcast, the reason why we said this is the most important thing you're going to hear today is that you have a picture in your mind of somebody that fits in this generation. Generations are not made up of statistics. They're made up of souled beings who are created in the image of God. You have somebody's picture or somebody's image in your mind that fits one of these generations, and now you know an anchor point for that generation, that person in that generation, to move in a conversation, to move toward them. And so think about it, pray about it. Think about some things that relate in that category of questions that you would ask that would make sense for that person in your mind, and start a conversation that moves them a step closer to Jesus.
That's what we're here for.
That's what we're here for.
All right. Episode 3 is finished. If you missed 1 and 2, please go back and get it. We are excited and would love your feedback. And next episode is...
We're focusing on the person of Jesus. We'll be coming up on Easter. It'll be right around the corner when the next episode comes out. So we'll be focused on the person of Jesus, and we're going to be talking about who Jesus is in maybe a way that you haven't thought of before. And that's going to be where I leave it.
That is a good teaser. All right. Thanks for listening.
Yes. Thank you for listening. All right.
What was the awkward?
All right. I was... Yeah.